The wind howled like a wounded beast as it carried the promise of death across the snow-covered plains of Wyoming Territory. Josephine Keller lay face down in the snow, her blood staining the white crystals crimson as consciousness slipped away from her grasp. The outlaws who had ambushed her stagecoach were long gone, along with any valuables the passengers had carried. They had left no survivors, or so they thought. The year was 1873, and winter in the West showed no mercy to the weak. Josephine had been traveling to meet her uncle in Laramie after her parents' passing in St. Louis had left her with nowhere else to go. Now, with a bullet wound in her shoulder and the merciless cold seeping into her bones, it seemed she would join her parents far sooner than expected. Preston Vance pulled his hat lower to shield his face from the biting wind. The cattle drive he'd been working had ended early due to the unexpected blizzard, and he was making his way back to his small ranch before the worst of the storm hit. His horse, Maverick, trudged steadily through the deepening snow, steam billowing from the animal's nostrils with each labored breath. As he crested a small rise, Preston spotted something unusual on the trail ahead, dark shapes half buried in the snow. Squinting against the swirling white, he recognized the remains of what must have been a stagecoach attack. The vehicle lay on its side, one wheel still spinning lazily in the wind. "Whoa, boy," Preston murmured, pulling Maverick to a halt. He dismounted cautiously, his hand moving to the revolver on his hip as he scanned the area for any sign of the bandits who might still be lurking nearby. The coach driver lay slumped over, frozen blood crusted around a bullet hole in his temple. A few yards away, two passengers, a middle-aged man and woman, had met a similar fate. Preston's jaw tightened as he surveyed the grim scene. He'd seen death before, but senseless killing like this still turned his stomach. He was about to remount and ride for the sheriff when a splash of blue caught his eye. Half buried in a snowdrift lay the crumpled form of a woman. Her blue traveling cloak fluttered weakly in the wind, revealing glimpses of chestnut hair and pale skin. Preston rushed to her side, brushing away the snow that threatened to become her burial shroud. She was young, perhaps 22 or 23, and despite the deathly pallor of her skin, he could see she had once been beautiful. A dark stain spread across her left shoulder, the blood already beginning to freeze. Kneeling beside her, Preston pressed his fingers to her neck, expecting to find no pulse. To his astonishment, a faint flutter beat against his fingertips. "My God," he whispered, "you're alive." Moving quickly, Preston shrugged off his heavy coat and wrapped it around the woman. The bullet seemed to have passed clean through her shoulder, which was a small mercy. But the cold was the greater threat now. If she didn't find warmth soon, she would never wake again. With gentle hands, Preston lifted her from the snow. She was lighter than he expected, her body limp in his arms. Maverick snorted nervously as Preston approached with his burden, but the horse stood steady as he carefully arranged the woman across the saddle. The journey back to his ranch would take at least an hour in this weather, and Preston wasn't sure if she would survive that long. Holding her in place with one arm, he swung up behind her in the saddle and pulled her close against his chest, trying to share what warmth he could. "Hold on, miss," he murmured, though he doubted she could hear him. "Just hold on." As Maverick began the slow trek through the deepening snow, Preston did something he hadn't done in a very long time. He prayed. He wasn't a particularly religious man, not anymore, not since the war had shown him just how cruel men could be to one another. But looking down at the dying woman in his arms, he found himself whispering words his mother had taught him long ago. "Lord, if you're listening," he said softly, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air, "this woman needs your help more than I ever did. Don't take her yet. Give her a chance." The journey back to his ranch seemed to take an eternity. The snow fell harder and the wind cut through Preston's clothes like a knife. Without his coat, the cold gnawed at his bones, but he hardly noticed. His attention was fixed on the faint puffs of breath that occasionally escaped the woman's blue-tinged lips. When the silhouette of his modest ranch house finally appeared through the curtain of white, Preston felt a surge of relief. He nudged Maverick into a faster pace, eager to get the woman inside before it was too late. The cabin was cold when they entered, but not as bitter as the outdoors. Preston laid the woman gently on his bed and quickly set about building a fire in the stone hearth. As flames began to lick at the kindling, he turned his attention back to his unexpected guest. She was still unconscious, her skin pale as the snow outside. Preston removed her wet clothes with clinical efficiency, averting his eyes as much as possible to preserve her modesty. The bullet wound in her shoulder looked angry against her pale skin, but it had stopped bleeding, which was something to be thankful for. After bandaging her shoulder with strips torn from a clean shirt, Preston piled every blanket he owned on top of her and placed heated stones wrapped in cloth around her body. It was an old frontier remedy his father had taught him, one that had saved more than a few frostbitten cowboys in its time. With nothing left to do but wait, Preston settled into a chair beside the bed. The woman's breathing seemed slightly stronger now, but her face remained still as death. In the flickering firelight, he studied her features, the delicate arch of her brows, the small scar near her right temple, the soft curve of her mouth. He wondered who she was, where she had been going, and who might be waiting for her. "You're safe now," he told her quietly. "Whatever happens, you're not alone anymore." As the night deepened and the storm raged outside, Preston kept his vigil. He dozed occasionally, but never for long, always jerking awake to check on his patient. Sometime after midnight, she began to shiver violently, a good sign, according to his father. It meant her body was fighting to warm itself. Dawn broke with muted gray light filtering through the frosted windows. The storm had passed, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. Preston was stoking the fire when he heard a soft sound from the bed. Turning quickly, he found a pair of confused green eyes staring back at him. "Where?" Her voice was barely audible, a dry whisper. Preston moved to her side, offering a cup of water. "Easy now," he said, helping her lift her head to drink. "You're safe. You're at my ranch, about 15 miles east of where I found you." The woman took a small sip, wincing as she swallowed. "The stagecoach." "I'm sorry," Preston said gently. "There were no other survivors." Her eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. "My name is Josephine Keller," she said after a moment, "and I believe I owe you my life, Mr. Vance, Preston Vance." He set the cup aside. "And you don't owe me anything, Miss Keller. Any decent man would have done the same." "I'm not sure that's true," she whispered, her eyes growing heavy again. "Not in my experience." Before Preston could respond, she had drifted back to sleep. This time, however, her breathing was deeper, more regular. The worst, he hoped, had passed. For the next 3 days, Josephine drifted in and out of consciousness. When she was awake, Preston fed her broth and tea, changing her bandages and checking for signs of infection. To his relief, the wound remained clean, though it was clearly painful. On the 4th day, she woke with more clarity in her eyes. Preston was mending a tear in his shirt by the fire when he felt her gaze on him. "Good morning," he said, setting aside his work. "How are you feeling today?" "Like I've been trampled by a herd of buffalo," Josephine replied with a weak smile, "but I'm alive thanks to you." "You're stronger than you look," Preston said, bringing her a cup of tea. "That storm would have killed most men, let alone a woman with a bullet wound. I've always been stubborn." She accepted the tea carefully, mindful of her injured shoulder. "My father used to say I was born arguing with the doctor." Preston smiled, finding himself curious about this woman he'd rescued. "Were you heading somewhere specific on that stagecoach?" Josephine's expression darkened slightly. "Laramie. My uncle lives there, my only remaining family since my parents passed last month. Influenza." "I'm sorry to hear that," Preston said sincerely. "Losing family is never easy." "No, it isn't." She studied him over the rim of her cup. "And you, Mr. Vance, do you have family nearby?" Preston shook his head. "Not anymore. My parents had this ranch. Pa died in '67, Ma followed a year later. My brother was killed at Shiloh." The words came out matter-of-factly, the pain dulled by time but never truly gone. "The war took so much from so many," Josephine murmured. After a pause, she asked, "Did you fight?" "3rd Colorado Cavalry," Preston confirmed, the memory of blue uniforms and red battlefields flashing briefly behind his eyes. "Came back in '65 with nothing but nightmares and a distaste for crowds." "Is that why you live out here alone?" Her question was curious, not judgmental. Preston moved to the window, gazing out at the snow-covered landscape. "Partly, I also promised my father I'd keep the ranch going." He turned back to her with a small smile. "Though I admit, conversation's been lacking until now." This drew a genuine laugh from Josephine, though she immediately winced and pressed a hand to her shoulder. "We should change your bandage," Preston said, gathering the supplies he'd prepared. "If you're feeling up to it, you might want to try sitting up a bit more today." With careful movements, he helped her into a more upright position, propping her with pillows. As he unwrapped the bandage from her shoulder, their faces came close enough that he could smell the faint lavender scent that somehow clung to her hair despite everything. "You have gentle hands for a cowboy," Josephine observed softly. Preston felt a warmth creep up his neck that had nothing to do with the fire. "Had plenty of practice patching up cattle," he replied, focusing on the wound. "And myself, on occasion, looking good, no signs of infection." "Will I have a scar?" she asked. "Yes," he answered honestly, "but it could have been much worse." Josephine nodded thoughtfully. "A reminder that I survived then." As Preston finished applying a fresh bandage, a comfortable silence fell between them. It struck him how quickly this woman, this stranger, had begun to feel like a natural presence in his home. The cabin had been quiet for so long that her voice, her very breath, seemed to bring life back to walls that had forgotten the sound of anything but solitude. Over the next week, Josephine grew stronger. She progressed from sitting up to taking short walks around the cabin, leaning on Preston's arm. They fell into an easy rhythm together, Preston tending to his livestock in the mornings while Josephine rested, then spending afternoons playing cards or reading aloud from one of the few books he owned. In the evenings, they shared meals by the fire, exchanging stories of their lives. Preston learned that Josephine had been a schoolteacher in St. Louis, that she loved poetry, and had once dreamed of seeing the ocean. In turn, he told her about growing up on the ranch, about the horse he'd raised from a colt, and about his brief time prospecting for gold before deciding the steady work of ranching suited him better. "I should try to send word to my uncle," Josephine said one evening, 2 weeks after Preston had found her. "He must think I perished in the attack." Preston nodded. "Next clear day, I'll ride into town. The telegraph office can send a message to Laramie." Josephine looked down at her hands, twisting a loose thread from her borrowed shirt. "I've imposed on your hospitality far too long as it is." "You haven't imposed at all," Preston said quickly, surprising himself with the vehemence in his voice. He cleared his throat. "What I mean is, you're welcome to stay until you're fully recovered. The trail to Laramie is rough even in good weather." "That's very kind of you," she replied, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Though I should warn you, I'm beginning to feel well enough that I might start reorganizing your cupboards. They're in a dreadful state." Preston laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to fill the cabin with warmth. "I won't stop you. Ma would be horrified at what's become of her kitchen." The next day dawned clear and bright, the snow glittering like diamonds under a hard blue sky. Preston saddled Maverick for the ride into town, checking that his pistol was loaded before tucking it into his holster. The outlaws who had attacked the stagecoach were still out there somewhere, and he wasn't taking chances. "I should be back by sundown," he told Josephine, who stood wrapped in a blanket in the doorway. "Bar the door while I'm gone, and there's a rifle above the mantel if you need it." "I'll be fine," she assured him, though concern shadowed her eyes. "Please be careful, Preston." It was the first time she'd used his given name instead of Mr. Vance, and the sound of it in her voice made something twist pleasantly in his chest. "I will," he promised, tipping his hat before turning Maverick toward town. The ride took longer than usual, the deep snow forcing a slower pace. By the time Preston reached Silver Creek, little more than a general store, saloon, and cluster of buildings serving the surrounding ranches, it was nearly noon. His first stop was the sheriff's office, where he reported the stagecoach attack and Josephine's survival. Sheriff Thomas Miller, a grizzled veteran of both the Mexican and Civil Wars, took the news with a grave nod. Sounds like the Blackwater gang, Miller said, jotting notes in a worn ledger. They've hit 3 coaches in the last month. Vicious sons of bitches don't usually leave witnesses. Miss Keller was lucky, Preston said. They must have thought she was already dead. Miller eyed him curiously. And you've been nursing her back to health all this time, at your place, just the 2 of you. Preston stiffened slightly at the implied impropriety. She was half dead, Sheriff. What would you have had me do? Miller held up a placating hand. Settle down, Vance. I'm not accusing you of anything. Just thinking of the lady's reputation is all. Preston hadn't considered that aspect. In his isolation, the social norms that governed town life seemed distant and unimportant. But he understood the sheriff's point. An unmarried woman staying alone with a bachelor would raise eyebrows, regardless of the circumstances. I'll be sending her to her uncle in Laramie as soon as she's well enough to travel, he said. Speaking of which, I need to send a telegraph. After arranging for the message to be sent, Preston restocked supplies at the general store. As he was loading his purchases onto Maverick, a voice called out from the saloon across the street. Vance, that you old hermit. Preston turned to see Jacob Foster, a neighboring rancher he'd known since childhood, waving him over. With a sigh, he secured his supplies and crossed to the saloon. Didn't expect to see you in town till spring, Jacob said, clapping him on the shoulder. What brings you out in this weather? Supplies, Preston answered simply, not eager to spread news of Josephine's presence at his ranch. Small towns bred gossip faster than rats. Join me for a drink. I'm celebrating Sarah's expecting again. Jacob's face split in a proud grin. Preston couldn't refuse such an invitation. Congratulations. That'll make 4, won't it? 5, Jacob corrected, leading the way inside. You'd know that if you ever came to Sunday supper like Sarah's always inviting you to. The saloon was warm and smelled of whiskey and tobacco smoke. A few men played cards in the corner while others stood at the bar nursing drinks. Preston nodded to familiar faces as Jacob ordered 2 whiskeys. So how's life out at your place? Jacob asked, passing Preston a glass. Still just you and those ornery cattle. Preston hesitated, then decided a partial truth was better than an outright lie. Had some excitement recently. Found a survivor of a stagecoach robbery during that blizzard 2 weeks back. Jacob's eyebrows shot up. No kidding, Miller's been hunting those bandits for months. Survivor, get a good look at them? Unfortunately not. It was an ambush, happened too fast. Preston sipped his whiskey, hoping Jacob wouldn't press for more details. Still, good thing you came along when you did, Jacob said. Poor soul would have frozen for sure otherwise. They recovering all right, Preston nodded, getting stronger every day. Well, you tell them they're welcome at our place if they need anything, Jacob offered. Sarah always says we've got room to spare. I appreciate that, Preston said, finishing his drink. I should head back before dark. Jacob studied him for a moment, a knowing look spreading across his weathered face. You're being mighty tight-lipped, Preston. This survivor wouldn't happen to be a pretty young lady, would it? Preston's surprise must have shown on his face because Jacob burst into laughter. Town's not that big, Jacob explained. Miller's deputy mentioned it to the telegraph operator who told his wife, who told Sarah when she was in for fabric this morning. He clapped Preston on the shoulder again. Don't worry, your secret's safe. Though you might want to make an honest woman of her before too long, if you catch my meaning. It's not like that, Preston protested, though the heat rising to his face betrayed him. She was injured. I'm just helping until she can travel to her family. Jacob smiled skeptically. If you say so. But I've known you since we were kids, and I've never seen you blush before today. Preston made his excuses and left shortly after, his mind troubled as he rode back toward his ranch. Was he developing feelings for Josephine? The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. He'd been alone so long that the very idea of sharing his life with someone seemed as foreign as the countries he'd read about in his books. And yet, the prospect of returning to his solitary existence, once Josephine left for Laramie, filled him with a cold emptiness that had nothing to do with the winter air. The sun was beginning to set when he finally arrived home. As he approached the cabin, he saw smoke rising from the chimney and light glowing in the windows. The sight stirred something in him, a longing for something he hadn't known he was missing. When he entered, the smell of cooking greeted him. Josephine stood at the stove, her hair tied back with a piece of string, stirring something in his mother's old pot. "You're back," she said, turning to him with a smile that seemed to chase away the chill of the ride. "I was beginning to worry." "Got delayed in town," Preston explained, hanging his coat by the door. "What are you doing up? You should be resting." "I've rested enough," Josephine replied, returning to her stirring. "Besides, I wanted to surprise you with dinner. It's not much, just beans and biscuits, but it's the least I can do to thank you." Preston stepped closer, the domesticity of the scene making his heart beat faster. "You don't need to thank me." "I do," she insisted, looking up at him with those clear green eyes. "You saved my life, Preston. You've cared for me, shared your home, given me your bed while you sleep on that uncomfortable chair." She gestured to where he'd been spending his nights. "A meal is nothing compared to that." Before he could respond, she continued, "Were you able to send the telegram to my uncle?" "Yes," Preston said, suddenly remembering the message he'd received in return. "He was relieved to hear you're alive. He wants to come fetch you as soon as the pass to Laramie clears." "Oh," Josephine's face fell slightly, though she quickly masked it. "That's good news." "It could be a while," Preston added hastily. "The snows deep in the high country might not be passable until spring." Josephine nodded, a small smile returning to her lips. "Then I suppose you're stuck with me a bit longer. I hope that's not too much of a burden." "Not at all," Preston said, their eyes meeting across the small kitchen. "Not at all." That evening, as they ate the simple meal Josephine had prepared, Preston told her about his visit to town, carefully omitting Jacob's teasing. When he mentioned the sheriff's theory about the Blackwater gang, Josephine grew quiet. "I keep trying to remember more about the attack," she said finally. "But it happened so fast. I remember the coach stopping, shots being fired, and then pain in my shoulder. After that, just cold and darkness until I woke up here." "It's probably better you don't remember," Preston said gently. "Some things are best forgotten." Josephine studied him, her head tilted slightly. "Is that what you do with your war memories? Try to forget them?" The question caught Preston off guard. No one had asked him about the war in years. People in these parts knew better than to bring up such things. "Some things can't be forgotten," he said after a long moment, "but they can be lived with. You learn to keep moving forward." "Is that why you came back here, to move forward?" Preston considered this. "Partly, but also because this land is in my blood. My father built this place from nothing. Leaving it would be like leaving a part of myself behind." Josephine nodded, understanding in her eyes. "I felt that way about teaching, like I was doing what I was meant to do." She looked down at her hands. "I suppose I'll need to find a new purpose now." "You will," Preston assured her. "Life has a way of revealing paths we never expected." As the weeks passed and winter settled deep over the Wyoming Territory, Preston and Josephine fell into a comfortable routine. Her shoulder healed steadily, though it still pained her in cold weather. She took over more household tasks, insisting that it was only fair since he handled the outdoor chores. Preston found himself looking forward to evenings more than he ever had before. They would sit by the fire, sometimes talking for hours, sometimes reading in companionable silence. Josephine had a quick wit that made him laugh more than he had in years, and a gentle wisdom that helped him see the world through fresh eyes. One evening in late January, a particularly fierce storm howled outside the cabin. The wind found every crack in the walls, making the flames dance wildly in the fireplace. Preston had just finished stoking the fire when Josephine emerged from behind the privacy screen he'd rigged up for her, dressed in one of his old shirts that she'd taken in to fit her smaller frame. "I've been thinking," she said, settling onto the bench beside him. "I should try to make myself useful while I'm here. Perhaps I could teach you something in exchange for all you've done for me." Preston raised an eyebrow. "Teach me, like arithmetic and such," Josephine laughed. "Only if you want. I was thinking more along the lines of dancing." "Dancing," Preston repeated incredulously. "What use would I have for dancing out here? Everyone should know how to dance," Josephine insisted, rising to her feet and holding out her hand. "Come on, one lesson won't kill you." Preston hesitated, then took her offered hand. I warn you, I have 2 left feet. My mother tried to teach me once and gave up in despair. Your mother wasn't a professional teacher, Josephine said with mock seriousness. Now, place your right hand at my waist properly, Mr. Vance. I won't break, and hold my right hand with your left. Preston did as instructed, intensely aware of the warmth of her body so close to his. They stood awkwardly for a moment, Preston rigid with the unfamiliarity of such intimate contact. Relax, Josephine said softly. Dancing is meant to be enjoyable, not an ordeal. Easy for you to say, Preston muttered. You're not the one about to trample someone's toes. We'll go slowly, she promised. The waltz is simple 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. You step forward with your left foot, then right foot to the side, then bring your feet together. With patient guidance, Josephine led him through the basic steps. At first, Preston stared down at their feet, his brow furrowed in concentration. He stepped on her toes twice, apologizing profusely each time, but Josephine merely laughed and encouraged him to continue. Gradually, he began to find the rhythm, his movements becoming smoother. When he finally dared to look up from their feet, he found Josephine watching him with a warm smile that made his heart skip a beat. There, she said, you're dancing, Preston Vance. I suppose I am, he replied, surprised at how natural it felt to hold her, to move together in the flickering firelight. Though we're missing the music. Josephine hummed a gentle waltz tune, and they continued to move around the small open space of the cabin. As they danced, Preston felt something shift between them, a boundary crossed, a new understanding forming. When the impromptu lesson ended, they remained standing close together, neither quite willing to break the spell that had fallen over them. Thank you for the lesson, Miss Keller, Preston said softly, still holding her hand. Josephine, she corrected him. After all this time, I think you can call me Josephine. Josephine, he repeated, the name feeling right on his lips. For a breathless moment, he thought he might kiss her. The desire to do so nearly overwhelmed him. But something held him back, a gentleman's restraint, perhaps, or fear of ruining what they had built together. The moment passed, and they separated, each returning to their respective sides of the fire. But something had changed. Preston felt it in the air between them, in the way Josephine's gaze lingered on him when she thought he wasn't looking. February brought a brief thaw, allowing Preston to ride into town for supplies and to check for any news about the Blackwater gang. He returned with disturbing information: the outlaws had struck again, this time at a ranch just 30 miles north. Sheriff says they're getting bolder, Preston told Josephine as they sat at the table that evening. Hitting homesteads now, not just stagecoaches. Josephine paled slightly. Do you think they might come here? Preston considered lying to ease her fears, but decided against it. She deserved the truth. It's possible. We're isolated, which makes us vulnerable, but we're also small, not much worth stealing compared to bigger spreads. What will we do if they come? Josephine's voice was steady despite her evident concern. I've been thinking about that, Preston admitted. I want you to learn how to shoot, just in case. Josephine nodded slowly. I've never fired a gun before. It's not difficult once you get used to it, Preston assured her. We'll start tomorrow, if your shoulder's up to it. The next morning, Preston set up targets, empty tin cans and bottles on the fence posts behind the barn. The day was cold but clear, the snow crunching beneath their boots as he led Josephine to an open area where they would have a clear line of sight. This is my father's old revolver, Preston explained, showing her a well-maintained Colt. Smaller than mine, easier to handle. With careful instruction, he showed her how to load the weapon, how to hold it properly, and how to aim. Josephine listened attentively, her brow furrowed in concentration. Remember, it will kick when you fire, Preston warned, standing close behind her to help position her arms. Brace yourself. Josephine took a deep breath and squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked through the winter air, missing the target by several feet. She winced at the recoil but maintained her grip on the weapon. That wasn't terrible for a first try, Preston encouraged her. Aim a little lower next time. They practiced for over an hour until Josephine's arms ached and her shoulder throbbed. By the end of the session, she was hitting the targets with reasonable consistency. You're a natural, Preston said as they walked back to the cabin, genuinely impressed with her progress. I had a good teacher, Josephine replied, her cheeks pink from the cold and exertion. As they reached the porch, Preston stopped suddenly, his hand moving to Josephine's arm. Wait, he said quietly, nodding toward the door. It was slightly ajar, though he distinctly remembered closing it when they left. Drawing his revolver, Preston motioned for Josephine to stay behind him. Slowly, he approached the cabin, every sense alert for danger. Pushing the door open wider with the barrel of his gun, he peered inside. The cabin had been ransacked. Drawers hung open, their contents strewn across the floor. The mattress had been overturned, and Preston's few valuables were missing a silver pocket watch that had belonged to his grandfather, a small leather pouch containing gold dust from his prospecting days. They're gone, he said after checking every corner of the small dwelling. Must have been watching the place, waited until we were out back with the shooting. Josephine entered cautiously, her eyes widening at the destruction. How did they know we wouldn't hear them? Gunshots, Preston realized. They knew we wouldn't hear them breaking in over the sound of our practice. This is my fault, Josephine said, her voice tight. If I hadn't been here, you wouldn't have been teaching me to shoot. You would have been inside, or at least able to hear them approach. This is not your fault, Preston said firmly. These men are predators. If they hadn't taken this opportunity, they would have found another. As they began to clean up the mess, Preston noticed something that made his blood run cold. Josephine's bag, which had contained the few possessions she'd had with her on the stagecoach, had been emptied. Among the items scattered on the floor was a letter, now unfolded. Josephine saw it at the same moment and rushed to retrieve it, but not before Preston glimpsed his own name written in an unfamiliar hand. She clutched the paper to her chest, her face flushed. Josephine? Preston asked, confusion and the first stirrings of betrayal rising within him. What is that? She looked away, shame evident in her posture. It's a letter from my uncle. A letter that mentions me. How is that possible? Josephine sank onto a chair, still holding the letter. Because I wrote to him about you, after you sent the first telegram. Preston waited, sensing there was more to the story. My uncle is Daniel Keller, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. The name hit Preston like a physical blow. Daniel Keller was one of the wealthiest cattle barons in the Wyoming Territory, a man known for buying up small ranches or forcing them out when their owners wouldn't sell. Your uncle is Daniel Keller, Preston repeated flatly. The same Daniel Keller who tried to buy my ranch 3 years ago. Who threatened to divert the creek that waters my land when I refused to sell. Josephine looked up, her eyes pleading for understanding. Yes, but I didn't know about any of that when you rescued me. I only realized who you were when I saw the deed framed on your wall. She gestured to the document hanging beside the fireplace. Preston Vance of Clearwater Ranch. When I wrote to my uncle, I mentioned where I was and who had saved me. His reply, she hesitated. Let me guess, Preston said bitterly. He told you to use your position here to convince me to sell. No, Josephine protested. He advised me to leave as soon as possible. He said you would never welcome anyone connected to him, that there was too much bad blood between our families. She held out the letter. Read it yourself. Preston took the paper reluctantly. The letter was brief and to the point. My dear niece, I cannot express my relief at learning you survived the attack. However, I am deeply concerned about your current situation. Preston Vance is not a man who will welcome you once he learns of your connection to me. There is history between us that cannot be easily set aside. I urge you to find a way to marry me as soon as the weather permits. You are in a precarious position, living under the roof of a man who considers me his enemy. Your concerned uncle, Daniel Preston, handed the letter back, his expression unreadable. Why didn't you tell me? At first, I was too weak to even think clearly, Josephine explained. Then, when I realized who you were, I was afraid. Afraid you would send me away before I was strong enough to travel, afraid you would look at me differently. Her voice broke slightly. And then, as time passed, I found myself not wanting to leave at all. I kept telling myself I would explain everything tomorrow or the next day, but the right moment never seemed to come. Preston turned away, struggling with conflicting emotions. The revelation felt like a betrayal, and yet, hadn't he come to know the true Josephine over these past weeks? The woman who laughed at his poor jokes, who read poetry aloud by firelight, who faced the challenge of learning to shoot with determination rather than fear. "Your uncle is right about one thing," he said finally. "There is bad blood between us. He's tried to force me off this land since the day he set eyes on it." "I'm not my uncle," Josephine said quietly. "I don't share his views or his methods." "But you're his family," Preston pointed out. "His only family from what you've told me. Where do your loyalties lie, Josephine?" It was an unfair question, and he knew at the moment the words left his mouth. But the turmoil of emotions, betrayal mingling with his growing feelings for her made it impossible to think clearly. "I don't know," Josephine admitted, her honesty cutting through his anger. "I love my uncle. He's been good to me, especially after my parents died, but these past weeks with you—" She trailed off, her eyes meeting his. "I've come to care for you, Preston, more than I should, perhaps." The admission hung in the air between them, too significant to be ignored, too fragile to be examined too closely. Before Preston could respond, a sound outside caught his attention: horses approaching at a gallop. Moving quickly to the window, he saw 3 riders coming fast toward the cabin, rifles in hand. "Get down," he shouted, pulling Josephine to the floor as bullets shattered the window, sending glass spraying across the room. "Who is it?" Josephine asked, her voice steady despite the fear evident in her eyes. "My guess. The same men who ransacked the place earlier," Preston said grimly. "They must have decided to come back for more." Keeping low, Preston crawled to where his rifle leaned against the wall. Another volley of shots splintered wood near his head, forcing him to duck lower. "They're trying to pin us down," he muttered. "Josephine, remember your shooting lesson. Can you use that revolver if you need to?" She nodded, her face pale but determined as she checked that the gun was loaded. "I won't let them hurt you." Despite the dire situation, Preston felt a surge of admiration for her courage. "There's a back window in the bedroom," he said. "I'm going to try to circle around behind them. If I can get to the barn, I can use it for cover." "That's too dangerous," Josephine protested. "They'll see you the moment you step outside." "Not if you give me covering fire," Preston explained quickly. "When I say now, fire 3 shots out the front window. Doesn't matter if you hit anything, just make them duck." "That should give me enough time to make it to the barn." Josephine hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Be careful," she whispered. Preston moved to the bedroom, staying low beneath the windows. At the back of the cabin, he eased the window open, wincing at the slight creak of the frame. "Now," he called. Immediately, 3 shots rang out from the main room. As the outlaws returned fire, focusing on the front of the cabin, Preston slipped through the window and sprinted for the barn. He made it inside just as more bullets kicked up snow where he had been moments before. From his new position, Preston had a better angle on the attackers. There were 3 of them, one by the corral, 2 using a fallen log for cover. Taking careful aim, he fired at the man near the corral, catching him in the shoulder. The outlaw yelped in pain and scrambled for better cover. "We just want the woman Vance," one of the men shouted. "Send her out and we'll leave you be." Preston's blood ran cold. They knew his name, which meant this wasn't a random attack, and they wanted Josephine, but why, over my dead body? He shouted back, firing again to keep them pinned down. "That can be arranged," came the reply, followed by more gunfire. The exchange continued for several tense minutes, neither side gaining an advantage. Preston's mind raced, trying to formulate a plan. He had the advantage of knowing the terrain, but they had him outnumbered. Suddenly, shots rang out from an unexpected direction: the cabin. Josephine had positioned herself at a side window and was firing at the outlaws, forcing them to divide their attention. The distraction was exactly what Preston needed. Moving quickly, he circled through the barn and emerged on the far side, giving him a clear shot at one of the men behind the log. He took it without hesitation, his bullet finding its mark. The outlaw collapsed while his companion scrambled backward, now caught in a crossfire between Preston and Josephine. "Drop your weapons," Preston commanded, advancing cautiously with his rifle aimed squarely at the remaining men. For a moment, it seemed they might surrender. Then, with startling swiftness, the outlaw who appeared to be the leader raised his gun toward the cabin toward where Josephine was visible in the window. Preston fired without conscious thought, the bullet striking the man in the chest. He crumpled to the ground as his companion threw down his weapon, hands raised in surrender. "Don't shoot," the wounded outlaw by the corral called out. "We give up." Moving quickly, Preston disarmed both men and bound their hands with rope from the barn. Only then did he allow himself to check on Josephine, who emerged from the cabin pale but unharmed. "Are you all right?" he asked, scanning her for any sign of injury. She nodded, her eyes fixed on the dead man. "I've never seen anyone die before," she whispered. Preston guided her gently back toward the cabin. "I need to secure these two and then ride for the sheriff. Will you be all right here?" "I'll come with you," Josephine said quickly. "I don't want to stay here alone with them." Preston couldn't argue with her logic. After ensuring the outlaws were securely tied in the barn, the wounded one patched up enough to ensure he wouldn't bleed to death, before the law arrived, they saddled 2 horses and set off for town. The ride was made in tense silence, both of them processing what had just occurred. It wasn't until they were halfway to Silver Creek that Preston voiced the question that had been troubling him. "Why did they want you, Josephine? They specifically asked for you." She shook her head, genuine confusion in her eyes. "I don't know. I've never seen those men before." Preston frowned, unconvinced. "They knew my name. They knew you were staying with me. Someone sent them." "You think my uncle?" Josephine began, then shook her head more vigorously. "No, whatever disagreements he has with you, Daniel would never send men to harm anyone, especially not me." Preston wasn't so sure. Daniel Keller had a reputation for getting what he wanted by whatever means necessary, but why target Josephine? If anything, having his niece at Preston's ranch gave Keller leverage, not the other way around, unless. "The stagecoach robbery," Preston said suddenly. "What if it wasn't random? What if they were targeting you specifically?" Josephine's eyes widened. "But why? I'm not wealthy. I don't have enemies." "But your uncle does," Preston pointed out. "And if someone wanted to hurt him, targeting his only remaining family would be an effective way to do it." The theory made a disturbing amount of sense. It would explain why the outlaws had returned specifically asking for Josephine, and why they had seemed to know exactly who Preston was. When they reached Silver Creek, they found Sheriff Miller at his office. The lawman listened gravely to their account of the attack. "I'll gather a posse and head out there right away," Miller said when they'd finished. "You two should stay in town tonight. The hotel has rooms available." "We can't leave the prisoners unattended," Preston objected. "My deputy will ride ahead with a couple of men," Miller assured him. "They'll secure the outlaws while I gather more men. I want a show of force when we ride out might flush out any of their friends who are still lurking about." Reluctantly, Preston agreed to the plan. The sheriff arranged rooms for them at the small hotel's separate rooms, with a pointed look at Preston that made clear he was expected to observe proprieties despite the unusual circumstances. As evening fell, Preston found himself pacing the small confines of his hotel room, too agitated to rest. The events of the day kept replaying in his mind the discovery of Josephine's connection to Keller, the attack, the dead outlaw. And beneath it all, the memory of Josephine's words, "I've come to care for you, Preston. More than I should, perhaps." A soft knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. Opening it, he found Josephine standing in the hallway, a shawl borrowed from the hotel proprietress wrapped around her shoulders. "I couldn't sleep," she said simply. Preston stepped back to allow her entry, conscious of the impropriety but unwilling to send her away. She took a seat in the room's only chair while he perched on the edge of the bed. "I've been thinking about what you said," Josephine began. "About the stagecoach attack being deliberate, it makes a terrible kind of sense." "Your uncle must have enemies," Preston said, "men who would go to great lengths to hurt him." Josephine nodded slowly. "Daniel has always been ruthless in business. He believes the end justifies the means." She met Preston's gaze directly, including his attempts to acquire your ranch. "Why is my land so important to him?" Preston asked, a question that had puzzled him for years. "Water rights," Josephine explained. He believes the future of ranching in this territory depends on controlling water access. Your creek feeds into the river that waters much of his grazing land. The explanation was simple yet profound in its implications. Control of water meant control of life itself in the arid West. That still doesn't explain who would target you to get to him, Preston said, returning to their more immediate concern. There's something else, Josephine said hesitantly. Something I haven't told you because I only just remembered it clearly. She took a deep breath. During the stagecoach attack, right before I was shot, I heard one of the men say a name, Jennings. Preston stiffened. Thomas Jennings, the rancher from north of Laramie, Josephine nodded. You know him, of him, Preston corrected. He's been feuding with your uncle for years. They both claim rights to the same grazing valley near the mountains. This new piece of information shifted everything into focus. If Jennings was behind the attacks, it meant Josephine had been targeted specifically because of her relationship to Keller. It also meant she wouldn't be safe until Jennings was apprehended. We need to tell Sheriff Miller, Preston said, rising to his feet. It's the middle of the night, Josephine pointed out. This can't wait until morning, Preston insisted. If Jennings is behind this, he won't stop coming after you. As Preston reached for his coat, Josephine stood as well, moving to block his path. Before we go, she said softly, there's something I need to say. Preston paused, struck by the intensity in her green eyes. Whatever happens next, Josephine continued, I want you to know that these weeks with you have been transformative. I came to Wyoming lost and alone, and then I nearly died. But being with you, seeing how you live your life with such quiet integrity, it's shown me what kind of person I want to be. She stepped closer, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her breath. I meant what I said earlier. I care for you, Preston, more than I've ever cared for anyone. Before he could respond, she rose on her tiptoes and pressed her lips to his in a kiss that started gently but quickly deepened with unexpected passion. Preston's arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer as years of solitude melted away in the warmth of her embrace. When they finally parted, both breathing heavily, Preston rested his forehead against hers. I care for you too, he admitted. More than I thought possible, but your uncle is not part of this, Josephine finished for him. What I feel for you has nothing to do with him or his disputes. It's about you and me, Preston. Just us. Preston wished he could believe it was that simple. But Daniel Keller was not a man who would easily accept his niece forming an attachment to someone he considered an enemy. And now, with the added complication of Jennings' apparent involvement, the situation had become even more dangerous. We'll figure this out, he promised, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Together. They found Sheriff Miller still awake, reviewing wanted posters by lamplight in his office. The lawman listened intently as Josephine shared her memory of hearing Jennings' name during the stagecoach attack. That fits, Miller said thoughtfully. Jennings and Keller have been at each other's throats for years, and Jennings has been known to hire unsavory characters when it suits his purposes. Can you send a wire to the Laramie sheriff? Preston asked. Have them question Jennings? Miller shook his head. Not on the basis of an overheard name alone. We need more evidence. He stroked his mustache thoughtfully. The men we captured might be willing to talk in exchange for leniency. I'll ride out at first light with the posse. As they prepared to return to their rooms, Miller gave them a speculative look. You know, if Jennings is behind this, Miss Keller won't be safe until he's brought to justice, and your ranch isn't exactly easy to defend, Vance. What are you suggesting? Preston asked. That perhaps Miss Keller should consider staying in town, or better yet, heading to Laramie to be under her uncle's protection. Josephine tensed beside Preston. I'm not leaving, she said firmly. Not until this is resolved. Miller raised his eyebrows but didn't argue. Your choice, miss. But be careful, both of you. The next morning, they rode back to the ranch with Sheriff Miller and his posse. The outlaws had been securely held overnight by the deputy and were now loaded into a wagon for transport back to town. The wounded man, desperate to avoid the hangman's noose, had already begun to talk. Says they were hired by a man matching Jennings' description, Miller told Preston quietly as they watched the wagon depart. paid to attack the stagecoach and make sure none of the passengers survived, especially the young lady traveling to meet Daniel Keller. Will that be enough to arrest Jennings? Preston asked. Miller shrugged. It's a start. I'll wire the Laramie sheriff with what we know. In the meantime, you two should stay alert. If Jennings learns his men failed again, he might try something more desperate. After the sheriff and his men departed, Preston and Josephine surveyed the damage to the cabin. It wasn't as bad as it could have been: some broken windows, bullet holes in the walls, furniture overturned during the initial break-in. Nothing that couldn't be repaired. As they worked side by side to restore order, Preston found himself watching Josephine, marveling at her resilience. She had nearly died in the snow, been forced to kill a man to protect herself, discovered she was the target of a dangerous feud, and yet here she was, sweeping broken glass with determined efficiency. "You're staring," she said without looking up, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Just thinking how remarkable you are," Preston replied honestly. Josephine paused, leaning on the broom. "I'm not remarkable, I'm just doing what needs to be done." "That's what makes it remarkable," Preston said. "Most people would have broken down by now." She considered this. "Perhaps I haven't had the luxury of breaking down, or perhaps—" her gaze met his. "Perhaps having someone to lean on makes all the difference." The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken emotions. Preston wanted nothing more than to cross the room and take her in his arms again, but a sense of responsibility held him back. They were still in danger, and he needed to focus on keeping them both safe. "I'm going to check the perimeter," he said reluctantly. "Make sure no one else is lurking about." Josephine nodded, understanding in her eyes. "I'll finish up in here." The next few days passed in tense vigilance. Preston reinforced the cabin's defenses as best he could, boarding up windows that offered too clear a line of sight, positioning furniture to provide cover if needed. They took turns keeping watch at night, though Preston often let Josephine sleep while he maintained vigil. On the fourth day, a rider approached from the direction of town. Preston watched through his spyglass as the figure drew closer, relaxing slightly when he recognized Jacob Foster. "Brought news," Jacob said without preamble as he dismounted. "Thought you'd want to know right away." Inside the cabin, Jacob accepted a cup of coffee from Josephine, eyeing her with undisguised curiosity. Preston had not shared the full story of her presence with anyone in town, but rumors had clearly spread. "They arrested Jennings yesterday," Jacob reported. "The man your outlaws identified matched his description perfectly, and when the Laramie sheriff questioned him, one of his ranch hands broke down and confirmed the whole thing." "Thank God," Josephine breathed, sinking into a chair. "There's more," Jacob continued. "Seems Jennings was planning something bigger. He'd hired more men professionals this time to kidnap Miss Keller here and use her to force her uncle to sign over his water rights." Preston's jaw tightened at the thought of what might have happened if they hadn't uncovered the plot in time. "Is he in custody?" Jacob nodded. "Locked up tight in Laramie, won't be seeing daylight for a long while if ever." The news should have brought complete relief, but Preston found himself troubled by a new concern. With the threat removed, there was no reason for Josephine to remain at the ranch. She would be expected to continue on to her uncle in Laramie, to begin the new life she had planned before the stagecoach attack. The thought of returning to his solitary existence, after knowing the warmth of her presence, filled him with a hollow ache he couldn't ignore. Jacob didn't stay long, clearly sensing the tension in the air. As he mounted to leave, he gave Preston a knowing look. "Sarah says to bring Miss Keller for Sunday dinner sometime, if you've a mind to." After Jacob's departure, Preston and Josephine stood together on the porch, watching the sun begin its descent toward the western mountains. The land was quiet, peaceful in a way it hadn't been in weeks. The danger had passed, but a new uncertainty had taken its place. "I suppose I should make arrangements to travel to Laramie," Josephine said finally, her voice carefully neutral. Preston nodded, his throat tight. "If that's what you want." "Is it what you want?" she asked, turning to face him. The question caught him off guard. What did he want? For so long, his wants had been simple: to maintain his ranch, to honor his father's legacy, to live in peace. But now, looking at Josephine with the golden light of sunset illuminating her face, he realized his wants had expanded to include someone he had never expected. "No," he admitted. "It's not what I want, but your uncle has no say in my life," Josephine interrupted firmly. "I'm 24 years old, Preston, old enough to make my own choices." "He won't approve," Preston warned, "not after everything that's happened between us." "Then he'll have to learn to live with disappointment," Josephine replied with a small smile. "Besides, I'm his only family. He may be stubborn, but he's not foolish enough to disown me over his business disputes." Preston allowed hope to rise within him for the first time. "What are you saying, Josephine?" She stepped closer, her green eyes bright with certainty. "I'm saying that I've found something here that I never expected, a home, a purpose." Her hand found his. "Someone to love." The word hung in the air between them, both a declaration and a question. Preston's answer came not in words but in action, as he drew her into his arms and kissed her with all the feeling that had been building in his heart since the day he found her in the snow. When they finally parted, breathless and smiling, Preston rested his forehead against hers. "I love you too," he said simply. "And if you'll have me, I want you to stay, not just for now, but for good." "Preston Vance," Josephine said with mock seriousness, "are you proposing marriage to a woman who's been living under your roof unchaperoned for weeks?" "What would the good people of Silver Creek say?" "They'd say it's about time," Preston replied with a chuckle. "According to Jacob, the whole town's been expecting it since I rode in with you that first day." Josephine laughed, the sound bright and joyous in the evening air. "Then we shouldn't disappoint them, should we?" 2 weeks later, they were married in the small church in Silver Creek. The ceremony was simple but joyful, attended by neighbors and townspeople who had watched their unusual courtship with interest. Jacob stood as Preston's best man, while Sarah Foster had taken Josephine under her wing, helping to fashion a wedding dress from fabric ordered specially from Cheyenne. To everyone's surprise, Daniel Keller himself arrived the day before the wedding. His initial meeting with Preston was stiff with unresolved tension, but Josephine's happiness proved a powerful mediator. "I can't say I approve of your choice, niece," Keller had said gruffly, "but after nearly losing you to Jennings' schemes, I find my priorities have shifted." He extended a hand to Preston. Water rights seem less important when weighed against family. Preston accepted the handshake, recognizing the olive branch for what it was. "Family has a way of changing a man's perspective," he agreed. The wedding itself passed in a blur of emotion and well wishes. Preston found himself continually distracted by the sight of Josephine in her white dress, her eyes bright with happiness as they spoke their vows before God and the community. That evening, as they stood together on the porch of their cabin, now truly theirs together, Preston marveled at the journey that had brought them to this point. "Do you ever think about how close we came to never meeting?" he asked, his arm around her waist as they watched the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "If I had taken a different trail that day." "I prefer to think of it as fate," Josephine replied, leaning into his embrace. "Some things are meant to be even when they seem impossible." Preston smiled, remembering the desperate prayer he had uttered as he carried her through the snow that first day. "I think you might be right." As spring blossomed across the Wyoming Territory, Preston and Josephine Vance built their life together. The small ranch flourished under their combined efforts, Preston's practical knowledge of the land, complemented by Josephine's organizational skills and education. When the local school sought a new teacher that fall, Josephine accepted the position, riding into town 3 days a week to share her love of learning with the children of Silver Creek. Daniel Keller, true to his word, never again attempted to acquire Preston's land. Instead, he proposed a partnership that benefited both their operations, a business arrangement that gradually evolved into genuine family ties as the years passed. On cold winter nights, when the wind howled across the plains much as it had on that fateful day, Preston and Josephine would sit by the fire with their children, eventually 3 strong sons and a daughter with her mother's green eyes, and tell the story of how they met. "Your father found me half dead in the snow," Josephine would begin, her voice warm with memory. And your mother was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. Even then, Preston would continue, taking her hand in his. He lifted me onto his horse, Josephine would say, smiling at the memory. And I prayed harder than I ever had before, Preston would finish. And somehow, against all odds, my prayer was answered. Their children grew up hearing this story, the tale of how a tragedy became the foundation for a life filled with love. And as the years passed, and Silver Creek grew from a small outpost into a proper town, the story of Preston and Josephine Vance became something of a local legend, proof that even in the harsh wilderness of the Wyoming frontier, love could bloom from the most unlikely beginnings. In later years, when their hair had turned gray and their steps had slowed, Preston and Josephine would still sit together on the porch of the home they had built, watching the sun set over the land they both loved. And sometimes, when the moment was right, Preston would lean over and whisper in his wife's ear, "You remember the day I found you in the snow?" And Josephine would smile, her green eyes still bright after all these years, and reply, "How could I forget? It was the day my life truly began."